Hello, everyone. My name is Rebecca Roscoe. We'll be getting started. I am the Senior Research Associate at SMU DataArts. I use she, her pronouns. Just to give a quick physical description of myself, I am a mixed race woman in my 30s with dark brown hair that is down, a black shirt, and gold framed glasses. I'm sitting in my office with a blurred background at my home in the traditional and unceded territories of the Lenni Lenape people, now known as Pennsylvania. On behalf of our team at SMU DataArts, we would like to extend our sincere thanks and appreciation to each of you for joining today's brief session that will provide context and understanding on our latest Arts-Vibrancy Index state release. I would also like to introduce my colleague and co-presenter, Dr. Jennifer Benoit-Bryan, who is the research director at SMU DataArts, and I'll just let Jen say a quick hello.
Hi, all. I'm really delighted to be here with you. Thanks for joining us today. We can't wait to dive into state arts vibrancy together. I use she, her pronouns, and I am a white woman in my 40s with a pink sweater on in front of a quilt that I made in my home in Chicago. And I want to acknowledge all Native peoples who contributed to this city, specifically the Kittihawa and the Potawatomi in Chicago. And I will pass it back to Becca to get us started.
Thanks, Jen. So at this time, I want to take an additional moment to pause and acknowledge the Indigenous peoples of all of the lands that we are on today. While we come today on a virtual platform, we just want to take a moment to acknowledge the importance of all of those lands. So from coast to coast, we acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territory of all the First Nations people. SMU DataArts specifically honors the Apache, the Caddo, the Comanche, the Coshada, the Tonkawa, the Wichita, and the affiliated K'iche', Waco, Tawakani, and Lenni Lenape peoples, upon whose traditional territories SMU DataArts now exists. Our team in the background will also share a link for you to learn more about the Native and Indigenous communities in your area. We invite each of you to share your own personal and local land acknowledgement within the chat. So first, some housekeeping. During today's presentation, everyone will remain on mute to minimize any background noise and to ensure good sound quality as we are recording today's presentation. We ask that you take a moment to find both the chat feature and the Q&A feature. There are icons for both at the bottom of your screen. We encourage you to use the Q&A feature for any questions and the chat as a channel to communicate any technical issues. Our team will be monitoring both the Q&A and chat throughout the webinar, and we will have time at the end of the presentation to answer a few questions out loud. Any other questions that we are unable to answer, we will follow up with via email. And finally, closed captioning is available for this webinar. If you would like to activate that feature, simply click the CC icon to turn on closed captioning. You will then be prompted to view closed captions via subtitles or by live transcript. If you need assistance with any of the features I just mentioned, just send us a chat. And to preempt the most common question we get, yes, we do have a recording of this webinar, and we'll send you a link to it so you can review it later and share with your colleagues who are unable to join us today. So here is our agenda for our time together today. We will explore arts vibrancy and the context of this new state release. We will celebrate the top 10 arts vibrant states and examine the methodology and a few key takeaways from our rankings and this new state data. Last, we will share arts vibrancy events on the horizon and ways to stay connected with SMU DataArts. So I'm just going to start with a little bit about who we are. Our mission is to provide and engage organizations and individuals with evidence-based insights needed to collectively build strong, vibrant, and equitable arts communities. We do this by employing cutting-edge research techniques and high-powered computing to test hypotheses, build theory, and increase understanding of the arts and culture sector. Many organizations engage with us through data entry into our cultural data profile. And before we dive in, I just want to share some framing specifically about why we care about vibrancy and what the Arts Vibrancy Index and metrics are really meant to do. So the index is our best effort to capture, celebrate, and learn about the rich kinds of arts activity that are happening within communities. Among all communities, there are differential strengths and potential opportunity areas to continue to increase vibrancy of arts in communities. So there are three main measures that go into the arts vibrancy metrics. The first being the supply of arts and culture, and that's reflected in the number of people and organizations that provide access and engagement in the arts. Two is the demand for artistic offerings in a community, and that's seen through dollars generated in arts and cultural activities. And three, finally, we use the kinds of public support from state, federal, and local arts agencies to inform vibrancy. So we combine all of these measures using a data-driven approach. When we're looking at these measures, we're only using nationally available data sources, and that helps minimize any biases in how the rankings might shake out. And I'll share a little bit more about that methodology in the next few slides. So really quickly, I'll just share a bit about how we bring in data for the Arts Vibrancy Index. When I say that when we analyze national data, there are a few ways we actually standardize that data so that we can create a level playing field for all kinds of communities. We all know that arts and cultural organizations don't operate in vacuums. They operate within their communities. So we tie both organizational data as well as community level data into an integrated data set. The dataset models, or it attempts to model the entire arts and cultural ecosystem using a variety of data sources. We get all of the in-depth financial and programmatic information collected from the CDP that reflects information from nearly 20,000 arts and cultural organizations. However, we supplement that data with data from the IRS, from organizations that are filling out a 990 form or 990 postcard. We also bring in data from national service organizations like Theater Communications Group and Opera America. This helps us obtain basic information on all arts and culture activity and helps provide context on areas that we don't have robust CDP data collection. On top of that, we bring in community level data from sources like the Census Bureau and TRG Arts. This allows us to see the characteristics of the communities and the people living in those communities. And then finally, we bring in public funding data, and that data comes from sources like the IMLS, the National Endowment on the Arts, and the National Assembly of State Arts Agencies. So in this integrated data set, we geocode all of the data points. So we're pinpointing the exact location of each piece of data, and then we link it all together, thus allowing all of the different data sources to talk to one another. And it also allows us to understand the context in which arts and cultural organizations work. So this map shows how every region of the country has vibrant arts communities that will appear. The darker the color green, the more arts vibrant a community is. And you can see through this map, the highly vibrant communities are dispersed broadly throughout the United States. From Ohio to Colorado, New York to Alaska, arts vibrant communities recognize regional artistic diversity and community success. This map highlights the 2023 top large, medium, and small communities across the country. And we just want to shout out two new communities that made it to the list this year. We have Milwaukee, Waukesha, Wisconsin. They joined the list of large communities. And then we had Canton, Massillon, Ohio, joining the list of medium communities. So within the map and within the top community ranking, we also provide arts vibrancy scores for every county in the United States. That you can look at with this map. And my colleagues will actually share a link to this map for you to explore so you can look for your own local community. So one last methodology slide, and like I said, we're happy to answer any questions you might have around methodologies any deeper, but we'll just keep this brief for the rest of us. So in total, there are 13 different measures for arts vibrancy. Those 13 all get compiled into one vibrancy score for this year's calculations. And that's a little different than how we measured vibrancy in the past. In the past, we only had 12 scores. This is the 8th year of arts vibrancy. So in this 8th year, we made some tweaks and added a new calculation. And in fact, we're actually always on the lookout for new dimensions that might further inform arts vibrancy, but they do have to be available as data points across all communities in the country. So they have to be nationally available data sources. Once we get all those data points in, we employ a statistical technique called factor analysis, and that helps us understand the extent to which each of these 13 measures contribute to the overall concept of arts vibrancy. So each of the 13 measures gets a different weight applied based on how much they contribute to arts vibrancy. So in that table on the slide, on the far right, you can see the percentages of how we weight each score. They range from 5%, like you see for the state arts measures, up to 10% for measures like contributed revenue. And like I said, the data from these measures come from the IRS, US Census, and the Census Business Pattern data, and they all come to us at the zip code level, and that's how we geocode. But from there, we actually roll up the zip codes into cities and counties, and that's what populates the map. And then for the first time, we actually rolled up these measures to the statewide level. And now I'm going to pass things over to Jen to present those statewide rankings and findings.
Fantastic. Thanks so much for that grounding, Becca. We're delighted to share the top 10 states out for the first time and celebrate the fact that these states have just really exceptional arts vibrancy. New York, New Jersey, Massachusetts are our top 3. But when we go a little bit deeper, we start to see other, not just East Coast kinds of communities: Minnesota, Maryland, California, Colorado, Illinois, where I'm located, Oregon, and Virginia. All 50 states are available in terms of their rankings on our website, as well as additional details that really break each state down into all of those individual components that Becca was describing of arts vibrancy. Before we go to the next slide, I just want to frame, or this is fine here, just want to frame that when we talk about arts vibrancy rankings, the framing can be a little counterintuitive. So we're going to talk a lot about the highly ranked arts vibrant states, which, higher rankings generally mean actually lower scores. So I just want to acknowledge that kind of quirk of language before we dive into this and start to think about what this looks like together. So states have really dramatically different contexts. I'm sure many of the people on this call can speak to unique contexts in your own states and the cultures within those states. We were really curious about how these arts vibrancy rankings might correlate or be connected to some of those contextual variables at the state level. What might help explain, or what patterns do we see that connect arts vibrancy and other kinds of contextual factors? And so we explored a pretty wide range of possibilities and found 3 really interesting relationships that we'll talk you through today. So one has to do with the percent of a rural population within a state, and generally we see higher arts vibrancy in states with lower proportions of rural population. That states that are ranking higher on arts vibrancy tend to be states with lower poverty rates as well, that often kind of travels together. And then that the 9 highest ranking states on our list that we showed you on the previous slide all feature at least one city, in many cases more than one city, that's in that top 40 most arts vibrant communities of the past year. So we'll talk about each of those individually over the next few slides. So we're going to look first at rural population, and just as a framing to keep in mind here, the overall proportion of the US population that lives in rural areas is 20%. And so you can see that New York is higher than many of the other states on this list at 12.6%, but still falls well under that kind of average ranking for rural proportion within a state. But we do have a few states that are on this top 10 list that buck that trend. So Minnesota at 28%, as well as Virginia at 24.4%, both have higher than average levels of rural populations in their states and are showing up among the top 20% or the top 10 of 50 states here in terms of arts vibrancy. We think that's really fascinating. Our communications team put together some really neat tools where you can mouse over and see each individual state with respect to some of these measures. So this first one I'm going to set up a little bit more for you. Along the kind of horizontal axis here, we have arts vibrancy. So that ranks from 0 all the way up to 50, just ranking the states in their kind of order on that list. So the ones that are on the left side tend to have higher arts vibrancy. The ones on the right side have lower arts vibrancy. And then for this particular chart, the vertical axis is showing the proportion of rural populations here. And we're going to kind of show you 2 specific dots on this map. We can pull both of them up and take a look at them kind of in conversation with each other. Both of these have actually the 2 highest levels of rural population in the country. So both above 60%, Vermont and Maine. But you can see that they still have a relatively large gap between their rankings. So Vermont is ranked 13th, Maine is ranked 24th, but still they're real outliers. They don't kind of follow this general slow upward slope of the kind of other dots that we see here. they're certainly kind of exceptional with respect to their high level of rural population, but still, more than we'd expect in terms of arts vibrancy given this general pattern. I'd encourage you to find your own states in this list, which is possible on our site. Okay, so shifting gears over to the next dimension that we're looking at, which is the poverty rate in cities. So the national poverty rate is 11.5%. And so right off the bat, we see New York as a strong kind of surprising first kind of primary state here, in that it has higher than average poverty rate, even though generally what we see in terms of the pattern is that as poverty rate rises, arts vibrancy decreases within states. That's not the case everywhere. So really interesting to see that pattern here. And again, on the next slide, we will show kind of all of the states scattered across. This is something, again, a resource you can mouse over on our website. We've highlighted two particular states here for you to take a look at and think about. New York is the first one. So you can see in terms of the pattern of dots on the vertical dimension, New York is a little bit above average, but is all the way to the left. It's the most arts vibrant state in the country. In contrast, we see New Hampshire here. It has a state arts vibrancy ranking of 40. So it's in the bottom 20% of states, but it has a very low poverty rate as well. Not the lowest at 7.1%, but close to it. And so it's interesting, to understand the general patterns of state contexts and how they connect to arts vibrancy. But I think where we get really excited to learn more about what's happening within states is when those states kind of buck that trend or that pattern. There are other contextual factors that are sort of driving arts vibrancy in these states as well. So fascinating to learn from and talk to individuals working in these states about their contexts. The final dimension that we wanted to share out today is the kind of co-location of cities that are arts vibrant on the top 40 list and states that are arts vibrant. So I want to start with this layer that shows from purple, where there's the highest arts vibrancy, kind of graded out to a bright yellow, where there's the lowest arts vibrancy. We can see the map of where states sit, and then we're going to overlay onto that some dots that reflect the top 40 small, medium, and large arts vibrant communities across the country. And when you take a look at this, I think you can see generally that there are quite a few of those black dots on the yellow states. But that there are some cities that are near state borders, like New York City, for instance, which we count as being in New York State, although we know that the kind of metro area of New York actually overlaps other states. So this, we think, is a useful tool, but one that has some constraints, just given that states sometimes, and the kind of catchment areas around them, aren't just reflective of one state's arts vibrancy. We have included a ranking for the top 8 arts vibrant states that don't have a high ranking city here. And all 8 of these states are sort of above average in terms of arts vibrancy. They all have scores below 25 for their rankings. Interesting to see that many of them are located near large cities and get some of those spillover effects. In all likelihood, Virginia gets some spillover from DC, New Jersey we talked about with New York, but that's not universally the case. So interesting to see, again, some of the states that can have particularly high levels of arts vibrancy, even if they don't have sort of a hub or a city that is driving that. We see the reverse as well, that Wyoming, South Dakota, and Idaho all score in the bottom 10 overall on state arts vibrancy, but each of those states has a city that's in the top ranking with respect to vibrancy. So the reverse is possible. You don't have to have an arts vibrant community in your state in order to land near the top of the rankings. And even if you have an arts vibrant community, if that's just one pocket in a state that overall has low arts vibrancy, that may not be enough to boost your state's score. So we've talked through quite a lot of kind of different dimensions of vibrancy and thinking about what this looks like within state contexts. We are truly very eager to hear about possibilities for leveraging this data. As Monica mentioned, or sorry, as Becca mentioned, this is the first time that we've shared out state arts vibrancy, and we're curious if this provides a new set of tools or information at a level that's useful to you. We'd be really delighted to hear from you either through the chat in this webinar or through emails about any ways that you might kind of leverage or use these state arts vibrancy findings, and whether or not there are other state level supports that could be useful to you that DataArts could provide. So I invite you to share any thoughts that occur to you in the chat here. And then we will also have some time for general Q&A at the end of the session. But I want to just tee up a couple of additional resources that we have available before we shift our gears into that open question chat. Let's see, and we'll keep an eye on the chat in case anyone is willing to share out how they might use these metrics. We would love to hear. So resources that you have available here, we have the State Arts Vibrancy Index, the map, and the data table where you can look into detail for your state and see each of those 13 rankings for all 50 states. That you can also navigate those kind of interactive kind of scatter plots of where states fall in terms of contextual measures, and access downloadable graphics, images, PDFs for use for advocacy purposes, for whatever kinds of uses you can put this data to. We're eager to support that. In addition, we have another webinar coming up that we're really excited about, where we'll be pulling together arts leaders from a variety of states to really think about insights into this data, how it reflects their own experiences and perspectives on the importance of thriving rural arts communities in particular. We're going to be pulling in a number of state arts leaders who can speak to what it looks like to support arts vibrancy, particularly in states that have higher proportions of rural population. And we're delighted to have that conversation be facilitated by Ryan Stubbs, the Senior Research Director at the National Assembly of State Arts Agencies. So if you can join us April 11th for a 1-hour conversation, we would love to welcome you back. So I will pause there and open the floor to any questions that people have. We're happy to talk more about methodology, about data sources, about the contextual kinds of variables that we looked at here, anything that you might be curious about, and eager to hear from you about how you might leverage or activate these state rankings. Okay, so I
Hey, Jen,
see, oh, yep.
Yep, you
Go
saw
ahead.
the question, just making sure.
Yep. Great, thank you. So a question just came in about whether or not arts vibrancy includes libraries or historic preservation efforts. Oh, Becca, do you want to answer that question? That would be great.
Oh, no, you go ahead.
Okay. So we are drawing on a number of data sources, like Becca said, for this. Generally, we're using NAICS codes for classifying organizations as arts and culture or not. And so if a historic preservation site, like might be a historic museum or site that would be listed as an arts and culture organization with the IRS, then that data would get reflected here as part of arts vibrancy calculations. Libraries often are part of government agencies that wouldn't be reflected here. There are some nonprofit libraries that might file, and if they get classified as an arts and culture organization, then they would be reflected here. But generally, this is not going to reflect the full range of libraries or historic preservation efforts that might be underway.
We have another question about whether there's a way to print out the data without it being in an interactive manner. So while we don't offer a printout of the map data, if that's what this person is asking in particular, we do have different web pages on our site for the top rankings. If you need some further accessibility assistance in getting specific data points, feel free to send us an email and we can help you get that in the format that you need. And then Jen, we have a question on whether there is a relationship with demographic composition, and I assume that this is for the state-based findings.
Yeah, we haven't looked to see whether or not states with more diverse populations or with specific racial or ethnic groups have distinct kinds of arts vibrancy, or whether or not that influences arts vibrancy rankings. It's certainly something that we could look at. I'm curious to hear, it looks like this question comes from Paramita, if there are any hypotheses that you have about what kinds of relationships you might expect to see between demographic composition and arts vibrancy.
We had a couple questions about more information about the 13 measures as well as the definition of those measures. So I just put a link in the chat to our methodology page for those of you who are more interested in methodology. That page should have all of the definitions and the weights, and it goes into a bit more detail. But if there's questions beyond what is shown there, definitely feel free to reach out with more specific questions. And we have another question from Jeffrey, who says he is not in New England, but he finds the contrast of Vermont and New Hampshire very interesting in regards to vibrancy ranking. What are the driving components of the data that create such a gap between the two? That seems like something we might follow up with, unless Jen, you have some off the cuff.
Yeah, I just went to our site and pulled up the AVI map. So it's nice because right under the map, there's a table that includes every state and their ranking on each measure. So I'm looking at Vermont, which generally has scores below average across most of these metrics. They're a little bit above average in terms of arts and culture employment with a ranking of 26. Rural population percentage. So that's a place where if you want to compare and contrast two specific states, you can kind of navigate to them. I want to pull up New Hampshire quickly too. Take a look and see where it falls on some of these metrics. So New Hampshire is ranked 40th in terms of overall arts vibrancy. Let's see where they do best and worst. They're particularly highly ranked, actually, New Hampshire, in terms of arts and cultural nonprofits. They're ranked 11th out of the 50 states on that. But on most of the metrics, they are ranked below average. Let's see. They're 49th in terms of federal arts funding and federal arts grants. So relative to peers and given their population, they are very much kind of behind the curve there. And it's not uncommon for states to really excel in certain areas and to have weaknesses in others, right? It's hard to excel across the board in terms of all of these dimensions, but given your question about kind of what's the fundamental difference at play here, it seems like federal funding is one of the places where New Hampshire is not doing as well as peer states.
Great, and we have, I just answered a question regarding how we determine regions. So those are determined by metropolitan and micropolitan statistical areas. That's just basically says, where's the city, the area around the city, and we take into context that population to determine region. And we have one more question regarding whether there was an analysis of grant makers funding arts and culture, if there was a direct correlation between ranking and amount of funding dollars.
So contributed revenue is one of the dimensions that helps determine arts vibrancy, and it's one of the ones that has a particularly high, it's a 10% of the total weight. So it certainly is part of the score that we use to generate arts vibrancy. That does make it a little difficult to look at compare correlations because it's an underlying dimension of how the score is developed. So of course it's going to be correlated with that metric, but it is one that we find to be particularly important in understanding this concept of arts vibrancy.
And I think Josh's comment is a great way to close us out. And Josh says how he could see how one could work with tourism agencies and local chambers of commerce to promote cultural tourism. However, there's a lot of nuance that's not here in this data. And I think that is something important to sort of keep in mind, this idea that the vibrancy index is only pulling in those nationally available data sources, and that a particular community might have additional resources or data sources that they'd want to pull in to further provide context for their community's vibrancy.
That's great. We had one other question, which I clicked the wrong button on saying I would answer it live. So let me just also address the relationship between arts vibrancy and the AEP6 survey that was conducted with Americans for the Arts. We see these as complements, that they help understand the breadth and the diversity of vibrancy and the kind of economic impact of arts and culture. And I think they do have some common measures that can help to funnel in and help explain, but they are separate efforts. And we think of them as in conversation, but not part of the same initial research or investigation. Excellent. And thanks for your comment, Josh. That's really, really helpful to think about how this could be useful and leveraged locally. We welcome any other comments and would really love to see you in a few weeks at that next webinar session. Thank you for joining us today.